Thank you. Okay, can we make a start? Right, I know it's quite late in the day, but I think it'll be great to have your attention for the next hour and a half or so. I will just have a quick recap of what I discussed in my previous lecture, which was last month, where we talked about, we were hoping to discuss the Indian architectural scene, and through these two lectures. One that relates to the kind of very early post-independence phase, which is 1947, India got its independence from Britain. And we have that first phase between 1947 and 1965, I would say. It would be good not to have that food, please. It'll be really good. Sorry, that's not very good. The first phase of the work that I wanted to talk about was 1947 to 1965, where certain tendencies were present. And what I'm trying to do today is to have the other end of that spectrum, if you like, about the 1980s, 1990s, where slightly other issues were at work, and it was shaping up the architecture at that time. What I talked about what I talked about in the previous lecture was that there were two or three tendencies present at that time. One is an interest in modernism, which comes on the back of people like Edwin Lutyens and various others being active in the colonial period, in the sort of just before the 1947 time, when there was emphasis on classicism, neoclassicism, emphasis on a particular classical project that was found to be a very important driver for the colonial identity. However, in the post-colonial period, in 1947 onwards, as India gained its independence, the intention was to kind of move away from it, to sever its ties completely with that sort of colonial past, if you like, and the images that were projected at that time, and to bring in, usher in a completely new scene. And that would be shaped by, it was thought at that time, by modernism. And the modernism would be something that would be abstracted, something that would, within its abstraction, begin to show a degree of timelessness, kind of as if this architecture has always been there, as if this architecture has always had a place. And therefore, there were abstracted tendencies. Abstraction, that is that, it's not relying on visual imagery, it was not relying on what you call iconography, known iconography, to represent a time and a period and an aspiration which was of the present of that time. And that was given a political steer by the first Prime Minister as well of India at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru. The idea was that if India could not actually sever its relationship with this colonial past, it would not be able to create a sort of new future. And hence, the emphasis on bringing in masters like Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn at that time, as I was indicating at that time in that previous lecture, which shaped largely what we find as the kind of the nature of Indian architecture in the 1950s into the 1960s. And it is characterized by, I was saying that it was characterized by this tension between an orthogonal organization and spaces that were shaped by often curvilinear elements. There was this sort of tension, which also represented a number of other tensions in culture and in sort of contemporary thought at that time. And I talked about how, in the work of Le Corbusier, in the work of also Charles Correa, who is an Indian architect prominent at that time, from that time onwards, and I'll talk also about the other architect that I think was quite important and is still quite important today, Doshi, that their architecture in the 1950s and 60s actually reflected and continued this modernist project. And that is to do with this abstraction, that is to do with the use of a very basic material palette and almost a kind of entire absence of color, and so on. In the case of Le Corbusier, there is a kind of use of a palette of primary colors, but it's a very, very restrained use of that. But the rest is about exposed concrete, brickwork, and so on. Within that, the idea was that these little bits, these fragments, could be pulled together into a unified piece of architecture. So the architecture was not, as I was arguing, could not be seen to be complete. The buildings were never complete. The buildings were never sort of fully formed, as it were. They were always in the state of making. And that, I think, is a kind of very important modernist trend that I think is prevalent in this period. Now, what I was also looking at geographically, the areas and the sort of three key cities that we will again continue to work on and see is Ahmedabad in Western India, in the state of Gujarat, which is this one. Then there is Delhi, which is the capital, which became the capital because Calcutta was the capital till 1912, and then the capital was shifted to Delhi, which was seen to be politically safer place, and therefore that's where Lutyens developed the New Delhi, which was a kind of big capital complex, parliament building and everything else in the 1930s. But also, I explained that Chandigarh was created as a new capital of a state of Punjab, the 7th state of Punjab here, where there was a need for a new capital because the original capital of, which is Lahore, which actually fell in Pakistan, and therefore there was this need for a new capital. So we'll still continue to talk about these, mainly Ahmedabad and Delhi, really, and to show how the later phase of the work is shaped up. I spoke about these houses, the Southern House on the right-hand side and the Mill Owners Association on the left-hand side, where those issues of fragments, incompleteness, and the kind of play between the orthogonal and the curvilinear elements were prevalent in Le Corbusier's work, and how that together represented this new beginning, the new dawn. I was also showing how Charles Corrier's work in the Gandhi Memorial Museum in Ahmedabad is defying some of the kind of notions of monuments, which are monuments are often taken as a kind of vertical element, how the horizontal was played on to develop this idea of a monument, which is a horizontal, very understated monument. So monuments in this particular case is not shouting aloud through scale and through proportion and through presence that I'm big and I'm here, but it's something that is very understated. And that also actually brings out a very important part of Charles Corrier's work at that time, which is this lateral translation of themes, so that a number of projects that he did in the 1960s were to do with sort of subtle understanding of how you might translate that, interpret that into a different condition, so that the permanence, for example, is never literally, or temporariness is never literally taken into a temporary material, but the use of permanent material, but used in a temporary way, or a kind of throwaway manner, is something that then begins to interpret an idea in a new context, in a new material. Today, I will talk about these two architects, continuing with Charles Corrier's work in the 1980s and 90s, but also Doshi, who's on the left-hand side, and on the right with Le Corbusier, who this year won the Pritzker Prize of Architecture, for architecture. He's about 90 years old, I think still active, still quite active, teaching, lecturing. He is still active in his practice as well, so a really interesting figure to think about. These two figures, Charles Corrier and Doshi, have possibly shaped Indian modern architecture, or contemporary Indian architecture, in the way that no one else has. And that, I think, is quite important to understand and fathom. But again, their work, like many, many others, has actually gone through many phases. So it starts off being very strongly influenced by, and as I'm trying to indicate here, that though she started his life, his background was not a trained, unlike Charles Correa, who was trained formally through schools of architecture, mainly at MIT, formally trained. But though she was not formally trained as an architect, he worked as an apprentice with Le Corbusier in Paris. And that's how, so he wrote a letter, he got accepted to become an apprentice, and that's how he spent his initial training in Le Corbusier's practice. And then as the new projects in India were coming up, the ones in Chandigarh that I was talking about, the Parliament building, the Assembly building, the High Court building, the Secretariat, and various other projects within the Chandigarh area, that he was then asked to shift back to India and to become Le Corbusier's representative, really, in executing all these projects. He was also working on the Mill Owners Association building, the left-hand side, and to an extent also on the Southern House, but mainly on the Mill Owners a lot. So a lot of the foundation of his this early life is about learning through Le Corbusier's work. At the same time, we should also remember that, and I indicated that before, that we also have Louis Kahn practicing at the same time in Ahmedabad, creating his Indian Institute of Management building, which is quite a significant agglomeration of structures. And those two forces, that is Le Corbusier's work and the work of Louis Kahn, begins to define Doshie's understanding and Doshie's architecture at that sort of early stage. And I'll show you some examples of that, as soon as, in the next few slides. So one, and which I think is still one of his most important pieces, is the School of Architecture, which is known as the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, CEPT. The CEPT School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, which has gone through various iterations, developments over a long period of time from 1966 to 2012, is a building which is very strongly, as you would probably see, and as soon as I show you a couple of other examples of Louis Kahn, yes, that's Louis Kahn in Ahmedabad, where he's creating these really large, large-scale developments of the Indian Institute of Management. You can see in the use of the bricks, in the use of the express concrete elements and so on, that what Doshie was trying to do over here, and a number of other projects of Louis Kahn across various countries, including the USA, that there was a very strong influence of Louis Kahn. There was also a very strong influence, if you look into Le Corbusier's museum building in Chandigarh, that has got a very strong resemblance to some of these, the use of elements here. So the use of horizontal, the beams and exposing those beams, then the water spouts, that the beams becoming water spouts and so on, they are elements that Le Corbusier uses as well. The treatment of that building, almost lifting the building, as it were, and sort of emphasizing the horizontal at that level and lifting that building above a landscape level is also another thing, so that it gives a kind of floating quality to the building. So those are kind of qualities that Le Corbusier uses in the museum. Louis Kahn's buildings have certain resemblance as well. And you can see that in the exterior, but also when you look into the interiors, you can see that in the windows, the very large-scale windows that are created to bring in light into the studios, the proportion of the doors, and the placement of brick piers and so on and so forth. So I think that's quite an important thing to look at and understand. So there's a very strong influence there. We continue that strong sort of almost brutalist influence into the interiors, in the various parts of the buildings. It is a really interesting agglomeration of buildings, but also a kind of layout of spaces which go from partly covered spaces to entirely enclosed and covered spaces to outdoor spaces. And that of course, resonates with the climatic conditions that the buildings try to address. The buildings are really incredibly well used. You would see that, if you go now, I've done lectures over there, and you'd find that these outdoor spaces become places where students, literally in the kind of traditional mold, there is this image of Indian sort of knowledge, the place of knowledge, that obviously Buddha's image is also connected to that the knowledge is imparted under a tree, under a banyan tree. And Lucan actually takes that image and talks about the institution. He talks about the institution started off by somebody who didn't know that he was a teacher, actually talking under a tree to people who didn't know that they were students. So this is the kind of almost the informal arrangement of the institution, which is shaped up by is given shape by this building. And you find that a whole range of spaces are created where, even right into the evenings, when you come out at 9 o'clock in the evening, there are still students getting together, collecting themselves together to read books, to do sort of study evenings and so on. And that's the nature of an institution that CEPT is. So it's a very vital, very vibrant place, even today. And a lot of that is shaped by Doshi's idea of what a school of architecture should be. A school of architecture is not just about making buildings, it's about engaging with a range of cultural activities and a range of cultural expressions. So the building is not about just the school of architecture, it's about on the bigger scale, environmental planning, on a smaller scale, product design. So it's a whole range of things that are included in that building and the students engage with. So they're not only just coming out as architects, they're coming out as product designers, they're coming out as interior architects, they're coming out as urban planners and environmental strategists and so on. So a range of things are happening there. And you can see that being used as, I can show you here, that these spaces are actually not only just spaces, they're created for a purpose of congregation, of pulling people together, of creating informal points of connection and contact and dissemination. That's where these places are. Now, while Doshi and Cobb, as I say, Doshi and Cobb were very closely connected, and also Doshi was very strongly influenced by Lucan's work, because also in the Ahmedabad projects, Lucan asked him to work with him. But there were other international influences as well, and Doshi is probably the first person to have acknowledged that this building, which was one of the earliest buildings, is the Institute of Indology in Ahmedabad again, which is very strongly influenced by a Japanese architect called Kenzo Tange, who was very influential in the 1960s. He did the Olympic stadiums and various other things, and it's a well-known range of work at quite a kind of major scale, large-scale interventions. There are also, very importantly, object buildings as well. So I think you would see the influence of Kenzo Tange in this particular project, where there is this sort of ceremonial staircase going up to the upper level. Again, the whole building has been lifted, a kind of element that pervades a lot of the work of Cobb, as I said, Cobb, Doshi, Charles Corey at that time. It's kind of lifting that building off so that the key public spaces are all kind of elevated to a higher level. And extensive use of concrete, of course, as you can see in this particular building. And this is kind of the sketch of how this building almost sort of sits as an object, as if it has arrived from outer space. Now, one can critique this by saying, to what extent is this about Indology or not? I think the concerns are kind of slightly broader in that there was this broader concern of having an architecture which, or has the fact that we have to have an architecture in India which would be different from anything that has happened before. So the very abstracted modern international style almost that was being projected here is a sign of that particular time. Although again, at the same time, that if you remember when I was talking about Charles Corey's work in late 1950s and early 60s, it begins to show a big difference. It's not as brutal as this, and therefore probably this particular piece of work stands out. and possibly aligns this particular project aligns itself with a few other people who were heavily influenced by the brutalist work of Le Corbusier and Kenzo Tange and so on. So there are some very interesting spaces created within that, without a doubt, within an incredibly simple palette of concrete, use of concrete for flooring, for walls, for sort of structural elements and all of it. As I said, that the influence of Lucan has been very important in a lot of Doshi's early work, and we have the various elements which are expressed in that work, but also the geometry. So this very strong organization around a kind of pretty rigid geometry, you can say, that you're using up the square, the breaking up the square through diagonals, and opening up access and passageways along diagonals and so on. And that's how the Indian Institute of Management is organized. These heavy masses, and you can see the diagonal living cutting through the building mass there, creating these kind of large ocular openings. We see this, as I show you here, that this is a kind of basic analysis of how the Indian Institute of Management was organized. And that's something that when Doshi was asked to do an extension of the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, in another city, he took on board. So if you look into on the right-hand side is Doshi's sketch of how, and his studies of how this particular, the left-hand side you have Lucan's original organization, Indian Institute in Ahmedabad. On the right-hand side we have the Bangalore one by Doshi. And here you can see how the diagonals are being expressed and understood, and how the passage, in this case, rather than moving from a very direct, straight axis and emphasis on the diagonal, as you can see on the left-hand side here, it begins to meander slightly, as the yellow ochre sort of pathways indicate. So there is a use of the diagonal and the straight side of the square to begin to create these passages through the building. And it creates a kind of very interesting environment. It creates an environment where, again, the concerns of, and you'll find that in both Doshi and Charles Correa, that the Indian, what they understand as the Indian sort of environment within which these buildings are located, has to operate within a range of enclosure conditions, if you like. So on one hand, if you have got a cold winter evening, you have to have a high degree of enclosure. And you have to have, or if it's very hot, then you have to have a high degree of enclosure, both in terms of sort of how it surrounds itself, but also on the top, as a kind of shade. But there could be, depending on the climate, there could be a range of opportunities to use architectural settings and create architectural settings. So it can go from sort of moving and losing the enclosure and just retaining the roof on top, to something where you have an entirely open condition. So those are the concerns. This range of habitation possibilities are a concern that they both employ in their architecture. So you see quite a range, and quite a kind of range of spaces, ranging from entirely enclosed spaces where it's necessary to semi-enclosed and uncovered spaces to entirely open spaces as well. And so you can see that, but it also creates this interesting play of sun and shade, which you will also find in a lot of Charles Correa's work. You can see that on the left-hand side, where the play of sun then creates in itself a new spatial condition, a slightly different indication of a space, where whether it's inside and outside, that kind of illusion begins to play quite a strong role. Doshi, as I said, in all of this has been working on, before this, as he was working with Charles Le Corbusier, Doshi was shaping up some of the Chandigarh buildings, the High Court on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the Assembly building. And again, of course, as I've already said, that the Mill Owners Association building as well. Now, these brutalist tendencies that you find in some of those buildings that I've already indicated, which is especially through the use of exposed concrete, very strong use of elements which will play really dramatic, have a dramatic expression through the use of sunlight, and exposure to sunlight. Those kind of elements are there, and I think you can see that in another piece of early-ish work of Doshi, which is a large auditorium building in Ahmedabad again, and where it's entirely use of exposed concrete elements over there. So again, a very strong influence of Le Corbusier in all of this work, as you can see here as well, where we have the staircases of the interior and how the light comes in from the top as well. You can see some relevant connections with some of the work that also Louis Kahn was doing in terms of expression of light. However, I think this is an important transition, I would say, in Doshi's work, which is his own architect studio in 1980. Again, many of these projects you will see have begun at a particular point in time, and it goes on, and that's the nature of many of these projects, that they've been worked on for a number of years. It starts off like the School of Architecture starts off in the 1960s, and it goes on till about sort of pretty recently. And I'm sure that there will be further stuff to do as well. And Doshi has been active in all of that. This particular one, which is a really important departure, I would say, from his previous work. While the previous work, as I've been trying to characterize, has been mainly defined by a brutalist use of simple material palette, very simple use of exposed concrete, exposed brickwork, expression of the structural elements, so that there's a kind of expression given to the structural shape of this building. Also, use of dramatic spaces, the dramatic use of light, and so on, and an abstraction. In all this building, you do not, in the previous work that I was showing, there's a lack of iconography of a particular nature. Any cultural reference is absent. It is explored through space making. But as we move into the 1980s, I think generally you'd find that India, which 1947 onwards shapes itself as a secular country with a secular identity, and that is given an expression through modernism, modernist abstractions, and so on, then begins to move away from that sort of very core belief that a particular kind of secularism is what it should adhere to. And there is a kind of growing awareness of the various cultural tendencies, which begins to an extent, fragment the culture a lot more. Or that, it gives sort of shape and form to cultural identities that used to exist and were in some way subsumed, somewhat synthetically, I would say, into a modern secular cultural identity. So those cultural identities are based on religion, on ethnicity, on regional backgrounds, and so on, begin to shape up again. And that is a tendency that I'm going to show you as we kind of go through into the next phase of this 1980s and 90s. So this particular building is about the architect studio, and what you would also see is this really very important part of this work and a number of other projects is that engagement with the ground, the engagement with a section, so that the part of the building is not the entire building is not above ground, but part of the building is burrowed into the ground. So therefore, the whole landscape and the whole building profile, if you think about the section here, sorry, I'll come back to that one. If you think about the section on the left-hand side, while these large vaults are present, the vaults are actually really giving tall shapes to tall spaces, which are used both environmentally, but also in terms of how light should be playing its role in this case. So environmentally, in the sense that, with the tall spaces, it allows the hot air to escape at a higher level, keeping the lower level cooler. And by burrowing it into the ground, it actually helps you to keep the place cool, because Ahmedabad being a place where temperatures can be quite high, it can rise to as high as 50 degrees Celsius over the summer, and in the winter it can be quite cold as well. So in a way, by burrowing the building and kind of by shaping almost the topography through the building, it gives a slightly different understanding of how the relationship between the building and a landscape should be. So in a way, the ground, as I was trying to say in the case of Le Corbusier's Mill Owners Association building, that we have to make the site all the time. We have to remake the site. In this case, what Doshi is doing is remaking the site by shaping up the topography. In the case of Le Corbusier's Mill Owners building, as I was showing, by creating a kind of complementary relationship between the landscape, the ground of the site, and the building itself, that you create a complementarity, create a fluidity between the ground, the immediate site, and how the building sits on it. So it is fabricating a site in that case. Here it's kind of sculpting the site, if you like. So also the vaults, if you think about the vaults that I showed you this image before, that this tendency, even the abstracted tendency in this case with Le Corbusier's Mill Owners building, where we were looking at the potential for eating into a volume. So if you think about a cuboid that has been hewn out, then you've got this sort of entrance. It's almost like a kind of a ruin-like quality, which has been imparted to it by hewing out things from a kind of big cube. But in this particular case, also what is clear, and from this rock-cut cave, if you remember that I gave you the example that some of the early Buddhist cave architecture, and this is where some of the Indian architecture of the early times are defined by this rock-cut caves. So they are not built pieces of architecture, but they're hewn out. So instead of adding up one on top of the other, bricks or stone or whatever, that you're actually cutting away, taking away from it. So it's a very different, almost the reverse of what you'd normally call architecture. And therefore, I think I mentioned that Edwin Lutyens, who was building Delhi and designing Delhi, very important architect, who also built the crypt of the Metropolitan Cathedral here. He felt that there was no Indian architecture because there was not in those early days, there weren't any, that is in the early days of Indian architectural history, that there weren't any buildings which were built up. They were all hewn out. So it's a kind of antithesis, if you like, of architecture. And that he never quite kind of understood, and he felt that there was no Indian architecture, and that if the West didn't implant new architecture, then there would be no architecture to speak of in India, which was obviously not, really correct, but nevertheless, that was the kind of point he had. So what I'm trying to say is that here there are these two things. One is this hewing out, taking away, subtraction, and also in that process, creating architectural elements, which are like the vaults and the kind of arches and so on, which you can see here, which also has an iconographic value, because they stand for certain things. They stand for a particular kind of Buddhist architecture. They stand for a particular kind of institutional quality, if you like. And when you look into then Doshi's work here, and he refers very directly to those rock-cut caves, here we find this interesting departure, that we are not talking about abstraction anymore, per se, but we're also talking about here iconographic elements being introduced into it. That certain volumes, certain forms, certain types of architectural elements that we can recognize as an image as well. Okay? So here you have the vaults which begin to speak about that kind of institution. And this idea, the name Sangat means it's kind of congregation, coming together, everyone coming together to work on architecture. And that's the whole idea. So in a way, the Sept School of Architecture, which he designed, slightly earlier, 20 years back, and his own architecture studio, really perform a similar kind of function where architects and students from all over the world are invited in to work together and to create different pieces of architecture. Now, so this idea of congregation, the Sangat, is also connected to this idea of the Buddhist, what you call the viharas, the places where the Buddhist monks would stay together, the congregational places and so on, where they will come together to worship as well. So, therefore, these elements, these vault elements and so on, had a slightly deeper connotation and a meaning than just its architectural form. So, what we see here, and one of the things that I do not show here, because I know that we could carry on to talk about a few more projects of Doshi, but what I was trying to indicate here is that Doshi's career starts off with being heavily influenced by international style, heavily influenced by the work of Corbusier, by Liu Kan, by people like Kenzo Tange and various others who were very active in the international scene around the 50s and 60s. And that shapes up, but also in that process creates quite a unique Indian architecture, if you like. So, especially the SEP, the School of Environmental Planning, is an example of how abstracted building forms can still be used to create architectural spaces which are of a very Indian nature. Later on, as I was showing with this Sangat building, you find that there is a much stronger move towards iconography, the kind of visible images of what Indianness should be. And that, I think, is a kind of interesting departure which I would like to associate with changing political culture in the country, where sectarian divides begin to emerge. There are political divisions along the lines of ethnic diversity, which begins to shape up the architecture. I have actually spoken about Charles Corrier's work, this one, which is the Gandhi Memorial Museum, in the first lecture, where we talked about these, this monument, as I talked about it, the horizontal monument, but within that there were these small elements which were inserted, as if they were these small little houses within a large field of space, a spatial field. However, if you look into the theme that I was talking about, this sort of emergence of a real desire to have an iconographic expression to the associated with architecture, so that it is understood as Indian. It is, the images talk about an Indianness. Is given shape and form increasingly in Charles Corrier's work as well in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And I'll talk through two projects here, which are quite important, I think. One is this Jawahar Kala Kendra, which is, Jawahar is, the first Prime Minister I talked about is Jawaharlal Nehru, a slightly difficult name to pronounce, but Jawaharlal Nehru was that modernist I was talking about, who felt that India had to dissociate itself from its colonial traditions and use modernism and use industrialization to actually go lunge forward. In the case of this particular building, which is in the memory of this Prime Minister, but it's an art center, Kala Art Center, Kendra is center. So art center in Jaipur, which is a North Indian city in the state of Rajasthan. Built around 1986 and then again added on and so on. And you can see how there are a number of things that I would like to sort of indicate here, and then we'll pick up again later, is this kind of specific use of steps and so on here, where the steps are made into a particular form, and I'll show you what they could suggest. There are sort of visible sort of symbols and signs being used. There is a particular use of material, cladding and so on, which gives a sense of being in a particular place. a particular city, a particular cultural context. And so there are already signs of covering over and, if you like, giving it another sense of completeness, a draping over, kind of cladding it, with new materials and new dresses, if you like. And that's where the iconography comes in. But also particular imageries, through the spatial fabrication. So they're kind of almost stage sets, that have been created. Admittedly, this is also a period which is strongly influenced by postmodern interests. And I think people like Charles Correa and also Doshi were not immune to that. So there are strong postmodern influences that come into the work. So that is true as well. Now, this place, this Jaipur, the city of Jaipur, was, in the Indian context, is a new town. Probably it's a late 17th century, early 18th century town, which is a capital set up by a king called Sawai Jai Singh, who therefore creates this city, this capital, for his kingdom in what is now Rajasthan. The interest in this particular city creation, city map, is also the identification with body, the identification of the body as a way of understanding the whole world. So if you like, the body becomes a kind of embodiment of the kind of wider celestial sphere, the kind of world around us, the stars and the whole universe that goes around us. And there are various simple structures or diagrams which were created from very early times in Indian culture, from the Vedic times. I'm thinking sort of going back to, say, 1000 BC, where certain particular kinds of geometries were used in an abstracted form to give shape to this understanding of the relationship between body and the universe. And therefore, in that, beginning to project the relationship between certain celestial beings, celestial bodies like the planets and the stars and so on, and how they influence our well-being, our conditioning on Earth. Now, there are a number of these diagrams. One of the simplest ones is this, and they're called mandala. Okay, so mandala means kind of encompassing everything, encompassing the whole world, the universe. And so that means both the body as well as the kind of the wider universe. And one of the simple ones is this idea of a 9 square principle. So you have 9 squares. These 9 squares are actually about the location of 9 different planetary conditions. And that 9 square principle, therefore, is an abstracted version of the universe in miniature. So, abstraction of the universe. And that, in a way, is what this Jai Singh, this king in the 18th century, uses to set up his capital. Now, the 9 square principle is there. What he then realizes is that in planting this as a city grid, if you like, then he realizes that there is a large hill which comes into that. So therefore, the 9 squares could never be completed. So then what he does is that he takes that 1 square from there and plants it over there. Okay? So the 9 squares are there, but in a way slightly distorted. So you've got this 9 square mandala in miniature saying that my city is the universe. This is, in a way, a kind of material manifestation of this whole world that we have to deal with. But in reality, what it does is that it displaces that 1 square onto there, and therefore that's what you get in the city grid. And then it is further modified when the palace comes in, the location of the palace, so that it kind of conflates as 2 squares to make 1 large space. So you can see that in the city grid, in the kind of real city grid, where this extension of the 9th square outside is clear. And that's where the hill is, that's where the royal palace and the whole setup is, which is quite a large setup. And that's based on the principle, and I think this is just a kind of very quick indication of the idea of the mandala, where the body sits within this diagram. So the indicating the kind of close relationship between also different parts of the body and the kind of celestial elements as well. And they are devoted, these various quarters are devoted to the various planetary systems, real and imaginary as well. So in creating this museum, this art center in Jaipur, what Korea does is that he actually uses this principle of the displacement. So if you think that this idea, as I've just talked about, the displacement of 1 square from there to there, and so therefore creating a kind of miniature universe, that he further miniaturizes, if you like, into this art center. What he does is that he creates the 9 squares and then displaces this 1 square right at the end to break out, but also in that process create an entrance space and so on. But this is the kind of auditorium and so on, and you can just see the indications of the different planets and the planetary systems, real and imaginary, around this indicated. The center of this is the sun, the solar system. So Surya means the sun, and then there are the various planets. There are also in the Indian system, the moon is seen as a planet, and therefore you have the moon here, you have the Mars and the Jupiter and the Venus and so on. Jupiter over here, Saturn over here in the corner and so on. So you have this, and the one on top is an imaginary one, which is, a mythical one, I should say, a planet that has been in the Indian system for a very long time and has got a very important role in this idea of rebirth, rejuvenation, and so on. So that's how he creates this particular structure. So in a way, the museum is a miniature version of the whole city. Sitting within the city, it represents the city as well. And it creates this sort of whole range of spaces, which, as I was showing you here, is made out of open spaces and sort of partly enclosed spaces, but very tight spaces as well. So it plays with a lot of scalar variety, of spatial scalar variety. So you can see kind of quite narrow spaces through which, and it's a public space, but it's quite narrow, and then you have steps going up, to upper levels and so on. Also, at the same time, you can actually enter other spaces underneath it. The whole collection of these buildings are to do with a craft center, so where training in traditional crafts can happen. So different craftsmen will come in and actually express their crafting skills. That will be also on display, visible, as well as it containing museums and other cultural activities, including the auditorium here and so on. So then what we also see here is the building up of certain imageries. So here you have a particular scale in operation, a very tightness, and it's almost suggesting a kind of domestic scale. You can see the domestic elements working here. And here you see a completely different scale. It's an openness, a large scale thing. And this is, as I was trying to show you here, that if you look into that, that is the sort of center, the solar location, the sun, and that's where it's given the kind of wider scale, the largeness. And then the other spaces like these are much more attenuated, narrowed down, and given a different sense of scale. So what you find then here is this is the space over here, Saturn space, and here what you see is a much stronger use of visual imagery. So it's painted, the ceiling is painted with certain celestial motifs, certain patterns of understanding the universe throughout Indian history. There are various representations of these universes that have been present, and the world has been seen in the form of endless oceans and seas and reptiles and fish and so on and so forth. But they are also indicative of particular planetary positions and their powers and interactions and so on. So a complex world of through the imagery to represent the various relationships that work within the universe and a kind of attempt to understand that. Now, these are ancient representations which have now been included, copied in, if you like, into the ceiling of this domical structure. Now, that then provides a particular kind of visible imagery of what Indianness should be. Here, what we are therefore talking about is a particular Hindu mythical emphasis. We are talking about also perhaps certain Buddhist elements, because the Buddhist stupa, which holds usually a relic of Buddha's sort of bodily existence at one point, and holds underneath it, and that's the kind of imagery that he's trying to use. So there is a conflation of a palette of iconographic sort of understandings, where we have images drawn up here, which common people will understand and relate to, and also these kind of structures that they will understand and relate to as well. So gradually, as we move away from the early period of abstraction, we see increasingly introduction of representations of different sorts. Representations, sometimes very literal, overt representations of cultural traditions. And in this particular case, I think one has to also understand that this is a period from mid-1980s onwards in India. There is a growing emphasis on Hindu cultural politics. So the religion of Hinduism begins to kind of re-exert itself, if you like, beyond secularism. And there are tendencies within the Hindu political scene who begins to understand and think about secularism as a deterrent, as a kind of way to be, not to be kind of followed, but something that has deterred Indian identity, if you like, and Indian expression. So, in a way, Charles Correa gives that political tendency a more overt expression. Possibly it's also happening in a state which is dominated by that kind of cultural politics as well. So what we have here is a very interesting mixture of cultural traditions, visual iconography of that type. And as I was saying, that there are different scales of iconography in operation as well. I was showing you those visual images. Here, as I was indicating before, there is almost a sort of tightness, a domestic scale, almost like village-like space, a kind of rural settlement, a rural condition there. And you can see that even expressed through the sort of very carefully crafted doors and other things, which are literally taken up from sort of traditional sources and traditional backgrounds. So you see a lot of these window openings and so on done in that way. So in this particular case, what we see, and this is, as I was indicating, is kind of spaces like this, spaces like that here, where you have a definite tendency to represent the Indian village. So on one hand, we have the imagery of a religious tradition that is being assembled, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And then there are also images of what constitutes Indian tradition, the village, certain other kind of conditions as well, as I'll see. On the other hand, so there is this one scale. On the other hand, in the central area, where the scale is big, as I said, much larger, because it's that sort of solar receptacle, if you like, where it's open to the sky, therefore it collects the sun, and it actually creates a kind of fantastic play of light and shade. You have a different scale of an image here, and as I was saying, through these steps and so on. The steps are actually also what you see on river banks, when you have the access steps to the river, because the river, the Ganges or various other rivers have been very important in Indian culture, and it is also to do with people thinking about it as a kind of point of purification. So you take a ritual bath, possibly previously every day, but more and more, at particular events and so on. So this steps are also indicative of a particular kind of scale, that is the scale of the openness of the river edge and so on, and also in the case of Rajasthan, where water is much scarce. It's to do with deep water wells, where there are stepped wells which go down, say, about 100 meters or so, right deep into the ground, where water is accessible, but also water can be retained because it does not evaporate so easily. So those steps are also indicative of a particular kind of concern of if you like, an environmental identity, if you like, in this case. So on one hand, we have the river, the scale of the edge of the river, an open scale of the city, if you like, and the urban edge. And on the other hand, what we see is the kind of the reduced down, the tightened up scale of the rural areas. So those images begin to shape up this particular building. So what is interesting, therefore, is that as we see going from Doshi's work to Charles Corrier's this piece of work, and if you can remember back about what I said about Charles Corrier's previous piece, the Gandhi Memorial Museum in the late 1950s, you see a major transition. The initial concerns of material expression, abstraction, incompleteness, the ruin, and the unfinished as a kind of expression of this timeless identity, if you like, without any iconographic presence, is gradually being left aside. And what is growing up instead of that is this sort of concern for visual of particular materials, of completeness, of finishing. If you look at all this, it's also clad in this red sandstone. The red sandstone is a very important material, again, used in Jaipur. That's how it's called the Pink City, because of its pretty much entirely being built in this red sandstone, so therefore, or clad in red sandstone. So this also represents the city in that sense. So not only in this mandala, what I was saying, that this interest in the diagram, so there is a kind of element of abstraction, but the abstraction is really not abstraction because it's used in this case as an image. So the abstracted plan of the city plus the visual image of this red sandstone and so on together make or give expression to a miniature city, if you like, of Jaipur. So the big city reduced down, made into this literally the 9 squares, one displaced, and then clad and given these kind of various symbols and so on. And that's how this particular building operates, which is an interesting building, but also it indicates the cultural departures, it indicates the political shifts. Now, the last piece that I would like to talk about is this, the building in the British Council headquarters in Delhi, which was created slightly later than the previous building, in about late 1980s, early 1990s. It was completed in 1992. Therefore, it's also a very important point in Indian political history. What happens 1985 onwards, sorry, is that this idea of the Hindu revival, the kind of Hindu supremacist ideas, begin to become stronger and stronger. And you find that there is also, in different quarters of India, there are sort of rising antagonism of Islamic traditions or Islamic cultures, Islamic societies, and so on. I'm not saying that it's a scale that is, if you think about a country of 1.3 billion people, the amount of problems that you have, sort of ethnic, religious problems, are minuscule in comparison to the number. So it is not often what you hear in the media is a slightly different view, but nevertheless, it is quite an important point of cultural departure. What happens gradually is, therefore, that especially in states like Gujarat, where Ahmedabad is the capital, and remember, that was at the forefront of the 1950s and 60s, sort of modernist movement. Yet what we see in the 1980s is a growing rightist tradition, especially with the Hindus tradition, but also in the Muslim quarters as well. So therefore, the kind of polarization grows to the point that there are a couple of major riots between Hindu and Muslim groups. And this leads to kind of significant antagonism across the whole of India, and culminates in very early 1990s in the dismantling of a mosque, 16th century, very early 16th century mosque in Ayodhya, a place called Ayodhya in North India. It's not that it was important, it was an important mosque. It was an important mosque in the sense that it was created by the first Mughal Emperor Babur in 1526, between 1526 and 1530. But it wasn't a particularly important structure. But what is really interesting is that the debate and the kind of battle surrounding what the significance of that site was. That Hindus have been claiming that the Rama, the two epics of Hindu epics, one is the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The Ramayana is one of the older epics in human history, if you like, apart from Gilgamesh's stories. You have Ramayana extols the life of Rama, this king who comes out of this place called Ayodhya, and then he travels and fights this demon king in Sri Lanka, comes back and establishes himself. But it's all about, the right path, about the truth, and so on and so forth. So he stands for that. And increasingly, in this Hindu revival and the political debate, Ram takes a center figure, and it's becoming very, very critical in all of this. And to the extent that when this mosque is then seen to be have been established in the birthplace of Ram. So therefore, it was felt by the Hindu groups that it would be actually important to dismantle this. Okay? And so this battle still goes on through the high courts and the Supreme Court of India and everything. It's still not resolved. Supreme Court is looking into archaeological evidence to find out whether that was the truth or not. They're finding all kinds of evidence, but it is also classified because of the sensitivity of the issue. But what I'm trying to say is that this kind of expression of ethnic identities, sectarian identities, religious identities begins to take shape and begins to shape up and move the secular culture away from that root into a new dimension. And so this particular building stands at that point of this heightened tension, and it does a number of things kind of quite interestingly, I think. Although again, you can see that, one can on one level say, oh, it's a postmodern expression. Of course, there are a number of elements there. But it's also the British Council headquarters in Delhi. Therefore, it is it's a collaboration between British artists, like the mural over there, Howard Hodgkin mural, and then the sculpture as well. They are done by British artists, and then the building is Charles Corrier's building. It actually, I think, if you read it very carefully, it's a really fantastic statement of Indian culture at that point in time. And that is what I'll try to explain a little more. If you look into the plan, on the left-hand side, I have got the plan where you, if I can show you through this one, you enter here from the main street, enter here. note the kind of, this gridded one is the real landscape, okay? So so you can see the predominance of the landscape. You know, the building is only there. That is the building. The rest are sort of outhouses, if you like, and sort of enclosures of different sorts. So there is an importance given to the ground, to the landscape, to the plan. And the landscape then again begins to purposefully, it begins to shape up with these sort of expanded squares, narrow passages, expanded squares, and so on. So it goes through the building. So you can almost read this one as part of the passage, right? Because it does the same thing as this one and this one. Okay. What it tries to do, and as Charles Corey explains here, is that as you enter the building, you enter this main building here, which is this piece. Then there is this garden over there, and then right at the end, there is this third thing, you know, this sculpture at the back. What he says is this: the building is an exploration of the relationship between India's past and the interactions with other cultures. So this other culture would mean that here, this building, in his view, stands for the Western architectural tradition, and that is represented by, in the colonial times, you had the viceroy, who was the queen's or the king's representative in India, right? The viceroy's house had a particular type of expanded villa type. You know, there was a kind of legible form and a pattern, centralized, axial, you know, symmetrical, and so on. So this building, for him, stands for that period of the Western cultural interaction. And what he does is that actually sets, and I'll show you in a minute, a kind of iconographic element here in the middle on the floor, which is very Western. And then he says that the next one, regressing into the past, you know, the next one is a relationship with the Islamic cultural tradition, which is a tradition, obviously, that comes in the 10th, 11th century into India, and therefore has a slightly predated relationship. The British come at a much later stage. So the British is the last stage. This is our city, the modern city, out here on the streets. So that's one stage, that is India today. India in the British colonial period, India in the Islamic times, and India back even farther into if you like, a Hindu past. So it's almost a kind of timeline, if you like, you know, that he sets up. And that's how he suggests the relationship with other cultures and India. What is interesting also is that, and that's, I will pick up the landscape in a moment as we go through. What is also important is to understand that as you enter the building from this gateway, the building actually disappears, you know, from your view. You see that building, obviously, when you're outside, you know, farther out, you see this. But as you focus on the entrance, the building actually disappears. What it focuses on, you can see, is the sculpture right at the back end. Okay? So, in a way, it gives, again, like if you think about the first building that we saw from the Gandhi Memorial Museum in Ahmedabad, it gives emphasis to the plane, the horizontal plane. Okay? An emphasis to the sculpture at the back, not the building. So the building becomes, in a way, a gateway again. Yeah? Because the building doesn't exist at that point. And you really, when you go through the building, for the visitor, almost very little part of the building actually on the ground floor is of relevance, because the upper floors are inaccessible from inside, and it effectively works as a tower, as a gateway. And sometimes you would see that in South Indian temples, that, you know, it's a very interesting one from, if you like, from a Western tradition or a North Indian tradition of temples or religious structures, where if you're accessing a central inner sanctum, you'd probably be going taller and taller and taller, you know, and into the sort of inner sanctum. Whereas in the South Indian temples, it does exactly the opposite. The towers on the outside are the tallest, and as you go to the inner sanctum, the building as a religious structure and its presence almost disappears. What you have is a very dark, sort of almost low-scale space, you know, within that. So it's a kind of a reverse of that. To an extent, that's what it's doing, that it's like a gateway, you know. The building is a gateway, as this one, the front is a gateway, the grill is a gateway, and then the building in itself is a gateway to the far end. What I'm trying to say is that the emphasis has shifted to that far end sculpture, which is that piece over there. Okay. So if you think about the front, what's happening is kind of quite interesting. It's a giant stage set, in a way, a theatrical piece, and you can read it in all kinds of ways. If you look at that, it is a cuboid. So in a way, you could say it's kind of quite a modernist piece. Then you look at it, you've got the eyes and the face and the nose. So it's a postmodern piece as well. There are kind of visual images kind of being played at. You've got the mouth in the darkness and everything else. But also, when you look much closer to these columns coming down, you would see in the way that the sandstone is aligned that you almost can read the columns. So there is a kind of neoclassical tradition as well of the colonnade of Delhi. Delhi being the Lurchen's kind of newly created capital, you can actually also read some kind of element of classicist tradition as well. So you've got these sort of almost 3 or 4 different layers to this front facade. But what is also interesting is that, this juts out that little bit, almost creating this, like a stage that has been propped up in front. So it's not something that is part of the building, because if it was just part of the building, it would have just completed the cuboid. But in this case, it kind of juts out on the side to say, well, the facade is different, separate from the rest of it. It's propped up as a stage set. So stage set here, dramatic expression of a tree. The tree, again, Howard Hodgkin does it as a tree of knowledge. Again, the Buddhist culture, as I was talking about, the quintessential sort of understanding of knowledge in Indian situations, that the knowledge is imparted under a tree, under a banyan tree, and the kind of the deep shade of that tree. So that's how it is. But what is also interesting, and I don't want to kind of get into great detail at this moment about it, but also the way that the library is located right on top. So if you go back to the plan, there are sort of 2 staircases up here, which kind of just is hidden behind that front facade, which takes you up to the upper level, which is the British Library, the British Council Library, which in any country, as you would know, that the British Council Library is the kind of key point of interaction between British culture or the Western culture, but mainly British culture, and that particular cultural context. And I'm sure that any international student will have actually seen that kind of thing. And that point of interaction, that point of access to this Western world, to this, if you like, a kind of post-colonial, but still quite kind of colonial presence of the British Council, and its activities is quite an important one. So in a way, what it is doing is that kind of almost taking people off the street as you come up this, and then kind of almost stealthily going up to the upper level, as if being unnoticed. However, when you come out of the library, you're no longer unnoticed, and so you're on stage. So as you turn out and come out to that stage, you are actually addressing the street. So what I think is also happening here is a bit of a kind of debate about what the role of British Council is in a kind of another culture. And that is to do with both a kind of colonial enterprise, a continuation of a colonial enterprise, and empowering certain people in a particular way, and then therefore creating a kind of degree of opposition, if you like, with the people on the street, the everyday street life, and the people over here who have not got the access to the British Council, if you like, and the people who are now becoming empowered through their knowledge, in a Western cultural tradition. So there's a bit of that stage set, that theatrical thing that goes on in this sort of front, area. And as I say, that the whole structure and the way that this propping up works shows that it is thought through as a kind of stage set as well. Now, the next thing is this piece over there, which is a very well-known, kind of cultural iconographic material from Rome, of course. And what it does is also provides this. What he does here is that what he calls the axis mundi. That in many cultural situations, in older traditions, that the idea is that our location on Earth is connected to the celestial world. That's how we begin to make our connections and make our relationship. As I was saying with the mandala, the body established within the grid. The idea is that we understand the body within a universe. We understand that we are part of that bigger expression. And the way that it happens often is this idea of the axis that connects up. So with the sky and the ground here. And our body often becomes that vertical element, which connects up. So in this case, what he is doing is that he's saying that by setting up these three axis mundi, representing three different relationships between India and other cultures, that he is actually making those connections, and trying to actually make those almost a kind of, if you like, a spiritual expression. So what he is doing here is, so I've spoken about the stage set here and what it presents to the city, to the outside world, to the Indian world. What then it does inside it is this kind of representation of this as the center of the axis mundi, which is this piece here. And then it goes into the courtyard at the back. Now this, what he calls, is the Islamic axis mundi, the connection with the Islamic world. Now, I will just go back very quickly to the plan to show you what I mean. So, as I was saying, that these expanded squares and the narrowed down passages, expanded squares and so on. If you look into the Islamic garden, like say Taj Mahal, which is essentially an Islamic garden with a tomb set at the far end of it, okay? It is that form of the passages, the pathways. The pathways also represent the four key mythical rivers in paradise in Islam. That milk, water, wine, and honey. These are the four rivers that flow endlessly in paradise, and therefore, the righteous person who goes to heaven has eternal access to that sort of life. And those four come together into a confluence, which is over here. Okay? So in Islamic gardens, you find over and over again the representation of these flowing water bodies, these channels of water, which come together, and then there are fountains which kind of mark that point. So essentially what he is doing here is actually setting up an Islamic garden, which starts up here, not just there. It starts up here and then kind of rides the way through to here. And there is a bit of a conflict here that begins to happen. So what that also does is that it makes a very clear reference to Delhi as an Islamic capital, because from 1096 onwards, Delhi is the center of India, the Islamic India, and so for that from then on to 1912, Calcutta ceases to become the British capital, moves to Delhi, so Delhi becomes another capital yet again. But for the whole of the Islamic period from 1096 to about I would say about 1830s actually, that the whole period that Delhi is the capital of Islamic India. Delhi is the capital of India, in a way. And by making reference to that Islamic garden, it actually says that, again, the building and the site is a miniature of Delhi. So the big city, which stands for a strong Islamic presence, but also things before that as well. But this city has been miniaturized down to this landscape. So in a way, he's creating a fabricated landscape, a constructed landscape, which doesn't actually exist. And that's interesting because if I can then draw parallels with what I was saying in the Mill Owners Association building, where Le Corbusier also fabricated a landscape, because there wasn't a landscape to rely on. There was no landscape of our cultural past. Okay? And therefore, in designing this one, which happens to be in one of the newer areas of Delhi, he is actually constructing, in miniature, a landscape which is resonant of the whole city. So again, this intention to reduce down a bigger city, the bigger universe, down to a kind of miniature in all these cases. So, therefore, we come to this water fountain, which here we can see that these pathways, which are essentially the channels of the water in paradise, which are being translated down to these pathways, which meet up in this water body here. But also there are a number of other elements, you can see these rings and so on here, which make reference to the Mughal past, because what used to happen in many of these outdoor courtyard spaces in Mughal court life would be that Delhi is a pretty cold place. In winter it can get to sort of close to 0, and then in summer it will go up to 50. So you've got a fantastic variation. So in both conditions of the very cold night or the very hot day during the summer, you would need shade. So these rings are actually direct, again, references, literal references to the canopies that would be stretched out over courtyards to make those courtyards, exposed courtyards, habitable. Okay? So there is a kind of a historical element inserted into that, where you have a kind of more paradisical representation down here, and on top what you have is a kind of more habitable, secular life, references to that life. So together, and there are other discussions to be had as well as to how successful that is, because one compromises the other, I would say. But together, they represent an Islamic world. Okay? Now, the third thing is coming to this far end. And incidentally, what is interesting is that if you look at the section, of course, you don't read a building, unless you're an architect, you don't read it as a section. But if you look at the section, you'll see that there are 2 levels of car parking and other infrastructural stuff underneath the building. But that ends at this particular point. So at this particular point here, the whole of these 2 levels of underground structure ends. So the only bit that's standing on solid ground for the back, for the rear part of the garden is that bit. So in a way, you could say that the only piece of the landscape that is grounded is that piece over there. The rest is actually sitting on or floating on 2 levels of car park. So that plus, as I was saying, the kind of visual emphasis and on the horizontal and to the right, to the far end, this sculpture, actually gives a slightly different reading of this building. That the building is really emphasizing a landscape, Islamic landscape, and its conflict with, if you like, this piece, which is based on a Hindu deity, Shiva. Okay, so there are kind of 2 sides of Shiva, the destructive one and the creative one. It's a kind of Shiva is one who kind of assembles the 2, because without destruction there's no creation, and those 2 work together. So there is this sort of representation here of the black and the white, both in granite, but one polished and the other one kind of rough hewn. So you have this sort of situation whereby the horizontal is emphasizing one kind of culture, and the vertical here at the far end is emphasizing a different kind of culture. And the 2 are essentially what the Indian culture has been and shaped by for a long, long time. Delhi has been shaped by the Islamic culture, which is the landscape which it creates, and then you have the kind of continual presence of, if you like, a Hindu cultural identity. So what I think also you see here is this kind of huge, almost kind of a conflicting, almost an unresolved relationship at that point, where the red sandstone breaks down into this granite basalt sort of surroundings. And this conflict is not resolved. This conflict is kind of almost exposed, to view. I would say that, if you look into this one, first of all, yes, this is the reading of Indian culture and a regression into the past and a kind of catalogue, if you like, of the points of interaction between the different cultural traits in India. But also it is this highlighting at this particular important political point where I was talking about the heightened conflict between Islamic culture and Hindu culture and the kind of that what shapes up politics and has been shaping up politics ever since, in the last, say, 20, 30 years. It is a representation of a kind of crucial point in political culture of India at that time. So you find that this piece, sitting at the end, also gives a hierarchy to it. If you think about it, through the visual prominence of this one, by allowing other things to recede back, like a kind of cinematic stage set, as if they kind of disappear, the emphasis is given to this piece, which presents a particular cultural emphasis, cultural tradition, emphasis on a cultural tradition, and which is a very Hindu one. So what I would say is that there is a kind of clear understanding, I feel here, of the cultural conflicts that we were in at that time, that Charles Correa was experiencing, being an Indian architect at that time, and to give expression to that kind of quality of conflict, that is there. So what it also tells us is that architecture is not just about solving problems and kind of creating a toilet in the right place, because then Le Corbusier would not have pushed the toilet right into the middle, as I was showing you before, because it actually raises questions. In the case of Le Corbusier's building there, if you think about that, Mill-Owners Association, putting the toilet over there also questions the modernist tradition. It questions the hierarchy, questions the servant and served spaces. It actually takes, say, Philip Johnson's glass box, where at the core, all the kind of the spaces that needs to be kind of hidden away, if you like, the toilet, the kitchen, and so on, are really pulled into the core. What he is doing in that Mill-Owners Association building is that releasing that core, let that go. So therefore, you're saying that the toilet can actually come out and take a different place. Therefore, it questions the hierarchy of things, and that's one kind of questioning. Okay? What it draws attention to is issues. And as I was saying that, the toilet and the kind of use of curvilinear elements are then used to ask questions about society as well. Societal status, people's status, servants, the role of outsiders, and so on, as I was saying in the previous one. In this particular case, what it's trying to do is to address, through a number of these projects, is trying to address the societal conflicts, but it's also a catalog, a very interesting catalog of how the culture has moved from its secular, a very kind of comfortable secular base that we were all, sort of wedded into and, we bought into, to something where it begins to become questioned. It begins to become a piece that is not so comfortable anymore, so sacrosanct anymore. And that's where the architecture begins to express itself more powerfully. There's a clear move from abstraction, therefore, and modernist intentions. So a grid is employed there as well, and a grid is employed in the case of the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur, the 9-square one that I was showing you. It's a grid as well. But the expression of the grid, the manifestation of the grid into an architecture varies quite significantly. That's a square grid, this is square grid as well. The Gandhi Memorial Museum in Ahmedabad, what it does is that it actually expresses that abstraction of the square grid. It celebrates that. It celebrates the horizontality in a particular way. But in this case, it is then built up over layers and layers of application, if you like, to the point that these visible elements take over. They are those kind of issues of visible scales of rural life, of city life, of urban edges. There are visible elements of religious rituals and so on. That begins to take over. And the grid recedes. The grid is not there anymore. You can't read it anymore. And that kind of gradual dismantling, if you like, of that abstract tradition is kind of quite an important one. And then in that process, we are also seeing the emergence of a whole series, or a catalog, or a palette of iconographic elements that are being used. And then the new generation of architects, more recently following on from Doshi and Correa and so on, are becoming more and more, attached to those kind of visual traditions as well. So that is where I think I will probably finish. But what I think is important, as I could say, that I think architecture is not about solving the problems. It raises issues. It raises questions about society and a culture that is at a particular point in time. So otherwise, we will be actually only repeating traditions. Okay?